In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgment, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild and unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgment is a matter of infinite hope. I'm still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and as I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt like I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unrelenting scorn. An unrelenting scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that registers earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope. It had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified. Flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the artistic temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness, such as I've never found in any other person, and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this middle western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, but the actual founder of my line is my grandfather's brother, who came here in 51 and is substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter-raids so thoroughly I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now felt like the ragged edge of the universe, so I decided to go east and learn of the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed I could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. My father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays I came east permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees, so when a young man at the office suggested we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month, but at the last minute the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went up to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man more recently arrived than I stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" she asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I felt that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. About a dozen volumes on banks and credits and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas, Morgan, and Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at through a single window, after all. I knew if I paused I would fuck up. After all. My house was at the very tip of the egg. No, I totally lost it. Fuck me. Yeah, my house was at the very tip of... It is a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It is on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. About 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals like the egg in the Columbus story. Both their contact ends are they are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual wonder to the gulls flying overhead. To the wingless, a more interesting phenomenon is their complete dissimilarity in every contour, in every particular except shape and size. I lived at West Egg, the, well, less fashionable of the two. But this is a most superficial tag for the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house is at the very tip of the Sound, the very tip of the egg, 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard, a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivory, and a marble swimming pool, and over 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore and had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the courtesy bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on the evening that I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college, and just after the war I'd spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven, a national figure in a way, one of those men who reach such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. Why they came east, I don't know. They spent a year in France for no particular reason. I think I missed something. They spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then traveled here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe her. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on, forever seeking, a little wistfully, for the dramatic turbulence. I knew it! I knew I missed something. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven, a national figure in a way. One of those men who reached such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. In college, even in college, his freedom with money was a matter of reproach. But now they'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east, I don't know. I'd spent a year in France for no particular reason and then traveled here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. Polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe her. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on, forever seeking, a little wistfully, for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened that on a warm, windy afternoon I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran towards the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens, and finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the sides in bright vines, as if from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, open to the warm, windy afternoon, glowing now with reflected gold and open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing on the porch with his legs apart. No. Tom Buchanan was in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. He was now a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a hard mouth and rather supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes that established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscles shifting when his shoulders moved beneath his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage. A cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness that he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even towards people he liked, and there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. I don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me, and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. "I've got a nice place here," he said, turning me around by one arm. He moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to Demain, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. "We'll go inside." We walked through a high hallway into a bright rose-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleamed white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little ways into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew the curtains in at one end and out at the other, like pale flags, twisting them up towards the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it, as wind does on the sea. The only stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they'd just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood there for a moment, listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear window, and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rug and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She sat completely motionless, extended full length at her. She sat at her end of the divan, extended full length, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it, which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eye, she gave no sign of it. Indeed, I almost apologized. I almost apologized for having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed. An absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too, and came a little forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. She laughed again as if she'd said something very witty. Then she held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face and promising there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. I told her how I'd stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. Do they miss me? She cried. The whole town's desolate. All the cars have their left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent howl all night along the North Shore. How gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. Then she added irrelevantly, you ought to see the baby. I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her? Never. Well, you ought to. She's... Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and put a hand on my shoulder. What you doing, Nick? I'm a bond man. With who? I told him. Never heard of them, he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. You will, I said. You will if you stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East, he said, looking at Daisy and then back at me as if alert to something more. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said absolutely with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it had me, for with a series of rapid, deft movements, she stood up into the room. She yawned and stood up into the room. I'm stiff, she complained. I've been sitting on that couch for as long as I can remember. Don't blame me, retorted Daisy. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon. No, thank you, said Miss Baker to the tray of 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. I'm absolutely in training. Her host looked at her incredulously. You are, he said. You are. He took down his drink as if it were the drop in the bottom of a glass. How you managed to get anything done is beyond me. I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. And I enjoyed looking at Miss Baker. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backwards at the shoulders like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with a polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. I realized then that I'd seen her or a picture of her somewhere before. You live in West Egg, she said contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single. You must know Gatsby. Gatsby, demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Before I could answer that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging a tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room, as though moving a checker to another square. I have a text. It's very distracting. I'm not going to edit this out, though, so you know that I didn't cheat the video. There's a link that I'm just not going to check. You can tell that I'm just so bored. This annoyed me. You will. Just in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East. Don't you worry about that. Dinner was announced. Wedging a tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the 2 young women preceded us out onto the rosy-colored porch, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. Why candles? Objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. In 2 weeks it'll be the longest day of the year. She looked at us all radiantly. I always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it. Do you always watch for the longest day in the year and then miss it? We have to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. All right, said Daisy. What'll we plan? What do people plan? She turned to me helplessly. What do people plan? Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. Look, she said. I hurt it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to do it, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great big hulking physical specimen of a... I hate that word hulking, objected Tom crossly, even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker spoke at once, with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desires. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy, I confessed after my second glass of corky but rather impressive claret. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in a strange way. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about everything. I've gotten to be terribly pessimistic about everything. Evidently, he had reason to be. I'm going to be a terrible pessimist about everything. Have you read Rise of the Colored Empire by this man Goddard? Why, no, I stammered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word these books are all scientific, continued Tom, glanced at her impatiently. Tom interrupted, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow's worked the whole thing out. Worked out the whole thing. It's up to us who are the dominant race to watch out, or these other races will have control of things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously into the fervent sun. You ought to live in California, began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. This idea is we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and after an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod. She winked at me again. And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see? There was something pathetic in his concentration. As if his complacency, more acute than of old, were no longer enough for him. Was no longer enough. When almost immediately the telephone rang, and the butler went inside. The butler left the porch. Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned towards me excitedly. I'll tell you a family secret, she said. It's about the butler's nose. Would you like to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be a silver polisher for a group of people in New York who had a silver polishing service. For a group in New York that had a silver polishing service for over 200 people. And he had to polish from morning till night until it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse, suggested Miss Baker. Yes, things went from bad to worse, until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me breathlessly forward as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her face like children leaving Pleasant Street at dusk. The butler came back, whispered something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again. "I'd love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he?" She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. "A rose?" "This is untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose." She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart were trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw down her napkin, excused herself, and went into the house. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up. She sat up alertly and said "shh" in a warning voice. An impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur rose up, mounted excitedly, rose up, dipped down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. "This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor." "Shh, I want to hear what happens," she said. "Is something happening?" I inquired innocently. "You mean to say you don't know?" she said, honestly surprised. "I thought everybody knew." "I don't." "Why," she hesitated, "Tom's got some woman in New York." "Got some woman," I repeated blankly. She nodded. You'd think she had the decency not to telephone him at dinner time. Almost before I grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of a white dress and the crunch of a leather boot, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. "Couldn't be helped," cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She looked at Miss Baker and then looked at me. She looked searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and then continued. I looked outdoors for a minute. It's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale, come over on the canard of the White Star Line, and he's singing away. Her voice sang. "It's romantic, isn't it, Tom?" "Very," said Tom, and then miserably to me, "If it's light enough after dinner, I'd like to take you down to the stables." The telephone rang again, startlingly. And as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. To a certain temperament, it might have been intriguing. My own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. Needless to say, the horses weren't mentioned again. After dinner, Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body, while I, trying to seem interested and a little deaf, followed Daisy around a series of connected verandas to the porch in front. A chain of connected verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. Daisy took her face in her hands, as if feeling its lovely shape, and gradually her eyes moved out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be sedative questions about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly, "even if we are cousins. You didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war." "That's true," she hesitated. "Well, I've had a very bad time of things, Nick. And I've gotten to be pretty pessimistic about everything." Evidently she had reason to be. I waited for a moment, but she didn't say anything more, so I returned rather feebly to the subject of her little girl. "I suppose she talks and eats and everything?" "Oh yes," she looked at me absently. "Listen, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear?" "Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things." Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where, and I came out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling. I turned to the nurse right away and asked if it was a boy or a girl. She said it was a girl, and I turned my head away and wept. "All right," I said. "I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool." "You see, I think everything is terrible anyhow," she went on in a convinced way. "All the best people think so, and I know so. I've been everywhere and done everything and seen everything. Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated." Her eyes flashed about, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated. The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. As if this whole night had been... I forget every time. As if this whole night had been a trick of some kind to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment Daisy looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had just asserted her membership into a secret club, to a secret society, which only she and Tom belonged. Inside, the crimson room bloomed with light. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post the words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tone. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned to the page, with a flutter of the slender muscles in her arm. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. "To be continued," she said, tossing the magazine on the table, "in our very next issue." Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee. 10 o'clock, she said. "Time for this good girl to go to bed." "Jordan's playing in the tournament tomorrow," Daisy said helpfully. "Oh, you're Jordan Baker." I knew now why her face had been familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had looked out at me from several rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Palm Beach and Hot Springs. I'd heard some story of her, too. Critical, unpleasant story. A judgmental, unpleasant story? But what it was, I'd forgotten long ago. "Good night," she said. "Wake me at 8, won't you? If you'll get up." "I will." "And good night, Mr. Carraway. See you anon." "Of course you will," said Daisy. "In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of fling you two together. Oh, lock you up in a broom closet, accidentally push you out to sea in a boat, that sort of thing." "Good night," called Miss Baker from the stairs. "I haven't heard a word." "Nice girl," said Tom after a moment. "They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way." "Who oughtn't to?" inquired Daisy coldly. "Her family. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to take care of her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to be spending a lot of time out here this weekend. She's going to be spending a lot of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her." Tom and Daisy looked at each other for a moment in silence. "Is she from New York?" I asked hastily. "Louisville. Our beautiful girlhood was spent there together. Our beautiful white..." "Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart on the veranda?" demanded Tom suddenly. "Did I?" said Daisy. "I can't seem to remember." "I think we talked about the Nordic race." "Yes. It just sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know..." "Don't believe everything you hear, Nick," Tom advised me. I assured him that I hadn't, and a few moments later got up to go home. They followed me to the door and stood in a cheerful square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, "Wait! There's something we forgot to ask you, and it's important." "We heard you were engaged." "Yes," corroborated Tom kindly. "We heard you were engaged." "It's a libel. I'm too poor." "But we heard it from 3 people," said Daisy, surprising me by opening up in a flower-like way. "So it must be true." Of course, I knew what they were referring to. The fact that gossip had published the bonds was one of the reasons I'd come east. You can't stop going with an old friend because of rumors, and on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. Nevertheless, their interest touched me and made them seem less remotely rich. Their interest rather touched me and made them seem less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was uneasy as I drove away, and a little disgusted. It seemed to me the thing for Daisy to do was to run from the house child in arms, but there were evidently no such intentions in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman in New York was rather less surprising than the fact that he'd been depressed by a book. Something was causing him to nibble at the edge of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptory heart. Already it was deep into summer on roadhouse roofs and at wayside garages where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. When I arrived back at my estate at West Egg, I rolled the car under its shed and sat for a while in an abandoned lawn roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night with wings in the trees and the full and persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered in the moonlight, and turning to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. A figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion. About 50 feet. A figure had emerged from the shadows of my neighbor's mansion about 50 feet away. Something in his leisurely gestures and the sturdy position of his feet upon the ground said that it was Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. A figure emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion and was regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely gestures and the sturdy position of his feet upon the ground suggested it was Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But I did not call to him, for he gave the sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He thrust his arms out seaward, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was shaking. Involuntarily, I glanced towards the dark water and distinguished nothing, except a green light that might have been the end of a dock minute and far away. When I looked for Gatsby once more, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet night.